Hi, I'm Marc Lynch, Director of the Project on Middle East Political Science at the Institute for Middle East Studies at George Washington University. Welcome back to our series of POMEPS conversations with leading academic specialists on the Middle East. With me today is my George Washington University colleague, Nathan Brown, one of the most prolific authors on Egypt and on the region, and for those of you who don't know, the recently elected incoming president of the Middle East Studies Association. Congratulations, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. Not a president-elect for another year.
And is it true that as soon as you're elected, you're going to begin issuing constitutional decrees which will give you indefinite and infinite powers?
I've already got them prepared, yes.
All right, excellent. With that, let's begin talking about Egypt. And specifically, since you're one of the leading experts on constitutionalism in the Middle East and on the Constitution itself, could you just give us your sense of the text of the Constitution, independently of the process? What's good, what's bad, what should we be worried about, and how do you evaluate the text of the Constitution on its own merits?
Well, the text of the Constitution basically takes Egypt's 1971 Constitution and works from there. And Egypt's 1971 Constitution was written by an authoritarian regime that was trying to reorient itself a little bit away from socialism, give itself sort of stronger rule of law credentials, but still it was essentially a presidential republic that it was establishing. Now what they've done is to take that document, ramp up the Islamic elements a little bit, ramp up the liberal elements a little bit in terms of public freedoms and so on, and try to rejigger some of the authorities, the ways that the parliament and the president interact and that sort of thing. Any constitutional text operates in a specific political context. And so it's sometimes, especially that's the case with executive-legislative relations. You know, if you took the American Constitution and plucked it down in Japan, it would operate very differently. So it's a little bit hard because the Egyptian political context and the party scene is so fluid and inchoate. It's a little bit hard to understand exactly how these provisions will operate in practice. But I suspect that if the Constitution takes on a viable life, and if you have Islamists in the presidency and an Islamist majority in the parliament, even if it's not all brotherhood, that you will get, I think, actually poor mechanisms of oversight of the executive. I think that's a problem. I think they're not doing as good a job reining in the executive as they want. And you're also going to get a host of Egyptian state institutions, most notably the judiciary and the military and so on, that will start out with considerable autonomy from the presidency, but over the long run, I think personnel changes may make those a little bit more friendly to the president if you've got a regularly Islamist president and a regularly Islamist majority in parliament.
So as the text is written now, what powers does the parliament have?
Well, the parliament has full legislative powers, unless it's not meeting, in which case the president or the upper house of the parliament, if it's in session, while the lower house isn't, has emergency power. But it's got full legislative powers. It has some oversight powers over the cabinet. But again, what I keep on coming back to stress is that it's not quite clear how effectively those will operate. One interesting fact about constitutions is in the 19th century, when the biggest constitutional battle in Europe was over the extent to which the cabinet, ministers, were politically responsible to the parliament, or were they only responsible to the monarch, that question was settled in political practice, and then later on written into European constitutional text. And I suspect that's the way we should read this document, that we can sort of take a look and sort of fine-tune. Can they bring down an individual minister? Do they have to go against the entire cabinet and that sort of thing? But it really doesn't make sense to really game this out until we have a better sense of who the players are.
Now, based on the text of the Constitution and based on Egyptian history, how hard would it be to amend this Constitution or to change it in significant ways?
It would be very easy if there's a strong majority in parliament in back of it. So a lot depends on the outcome of parliamentary elections. There is a plebiscite that has to be held, but that's just 50% plus one. Or actually, I shouldn't even say 50% plus one. It's a raw plurality. So if a lot of people stay home or submit spoiled ballots, all you need is a plurality yes vote. So what happens essentially, as we will see with the referendum perhaps, is when you get things to a referendum, whoever's proposing a constitution or constitutional amendment is probably going to win. The real battle is going to take place in Parliament, where you need a supermajority. And so again, you really have to know how the parliamentary elections are going to turn out before you know how easy this document is going to operate.
Now, in terms of the fears of this creating an Islamic theocracy, you've basically said that a lot will depend on practice and on what the president and the parliament agree upon. But in the text of the Constitution itself, what is there that is or should be worrying in terms of producing an Islamic state?
Well, I think there's an awful lot that people who have those fears would look to and say, and point to and say, we've got problems there. Theocracy to me is not the right term to use, because you're not talking about a political system that will be run by clerics, or which the president will have some kind of religious authority. But you do have clauses within there that we're not quite sure how they operate, but could shove Egyptian politics in a religious direction. And here they are. I mean, first they took all the Islamic provisions of the 1971 Constitution. So there's a provision that says the principles of the Islamic Sharia shall be the main source of legislation. But then they have a provision which defines what the principles of the Islamic Sharia are in a way that appears to write in about, over a millennium of Sunni jurisprudence. It is not attached to any implementing structure. It's not quite clear who's supposed to be doing this. There's a strong advisory role for Al-Azhar, and what the Constitution says is that in matters of the Islamic Sharia, the opinion of Al-Azhar should be taken, or not of Al-Azhar, of the Committee of Senior Scholars of Al-Azhar, which is a specific body within Al-Azhar. So all of a sudden that body becomes important. Now, it's just, the Constitution simply says you have to take their opinion. But it seems to me that if you actually have procedures worked out where Al-Azhar is publicly consulted and the Committee of Senior Scholars publicly come back with an answer, it's going to be very difficult for any politician to ignore Al-Azhar's advice. So there is, I think, something to be concerned about. And then finally, there's a whole host of religiously conservative provisions. Some of these seem to have some teeth, preventing insults to the prophets, and some of them just sort of talk about family values and conservative values and that sort of thing in ways, again, that aren't married to any kind of implementing structure. But you could imagine a situation, for instance, in which courts use those ideological provisions to interpret the other provisions, the more mechanical nuts and bolts, in a very conservative way.
Now, you've also said that there's reasons to see some advances for liberal ideas as well. What are the good parts from a liberal perspective? Well,
there absolutely are some. The Egyptian constitutions have always had extensive rights provisions, and they've always been designed, I'd like to say, to list rights rather than to protect them. This one actually does make some effort in making a lot of those rights absolute. Again, there's no real clear implementation, and Egypt's legislative framework is still fairly authoritarian. So there's a whole host of laws that are on the books in Egypt that will have to be revised if this constitution is going to be taken seriously. But if you have a constitutional court that takes those rights provisions seriously, it is quite possible that they could give real and much stronger protection to things like freedom of the press, and more notably, freedom for civil society and freedom for political parties.
Now, let's take a step back now. That's the text itself, but as we all know, that it's the process, probably more than the text itself, which has driven the political crisis that Egypt has been going through. And let's start with Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood. We've been studying them for a long time and following them for a long time. Do you think that this is a departure for Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood? Have they changed in some way? How do you interpret this in relation to their past political practice and political thought?
There is a change. In a sense, everybody is operating in the dark, and the Brotherhood is one of those parties that is operating in the dark, because you have a constitution that's being written in a very public and supposedly participatory process. Nobody has any experience with that. The Brotherhood is operating a little bit differently because they're now at the apex of the political system. They are very used to operating in opposition, and they're very used to trying to convey to other political actors that they do not seek to win the political game, but only to participate in it. That was their slogan under the Mubarak regime: participation, not domination. Well, it's a little bit hard to do that when you've got the presidency, and when also you have this tremendous electoral machine that seems to be able to produce very impressive turnouts, whether it's an absolute majority or not. So I think what the Brotherhood is in a sense kind of caught right now. They've got established patterns of doing things, looking at things from the perspective of an opposition movement, convinced, sometimes with reason, that they're isolated, that other political forces are suspicious of them, that the cards are stacked against them, and so on. At the same time as they're trying to run a state. And I think an awful lot of their missteps over the past couple months have been due to the fact that you've still got an insular and I won't say paranoid, but a very anxious organization which now has powers it's just not used to exercising.
How seriously should we take the Brotherhood's complaints that they were responding to an imminent attack by the Constitutional Court, that they were trying to preserve the democratic framework from the undemocratic courts, and that sort of thing?
Well, the complaints are sincere. I think they really believe this. Is there a basis? Yes. There is a basis, but it was greatly exaggerated, and their response, I think, was counterproductive. What they were essentially concerned about was that the court would not simply disband the Constituent Assembly, but that they would overturn Morsi's August constitutional declaration, which threw the SCAF out of political power. So if they did that, then all of a sudden the SCAF would be called back to power. Morsi's powers as president would be diminished. Almost to the point of zero, perhaps. His legislative authority would be stripped away from him, and you could have, even according to some readings, Tantawi brought back to lead Egypt. So this was a real nightmare. Was it going to happen? No, I don't think so. I don't think anybody who studies the court thinks that it was going to do so. You did have one particular judge on the court, Tahani Gabali, who was very outspoken, and probably would have used her gavel to bang the Brotherhood back to the Stone Age if she could. But she was one vote on the court, and there was no indication whatsoever that the court as a whole would have even tried something so audacious. So I don't think so. And that's the core of the problem. By reacting so strongly, what they did was they took a process that was essentially working with in their favor in a very clunky way. They may have lost the Constituent Assembly, but they would have been, Morsi would have had the authority then to appoint a new one and whoever he wanted to that body. They took something that was working for them and basically managed to alienate all the non-Islamist part of the spectrum, an awful lot of the judiciary, set off alarm bells in the international community, again, by taking what was a legitimate concern and blowing it out of proportion.
Now, you were oft quoted with your remark to the effect of Morsi was already all-powerful, and now he's made himself even aller-powerful, or something to that effect.
Yeah.
But now, 5 days or 10 days later, Morsi has rescinded the decree. He puts forward a tax change in fuel subsidies, which then he immediately has to withdraw. He has hundreds of thousands of people in the streets protesting and has been forced to backtrack on a number of things. How powerful is Morsi in this kind of environment?
Well, I think you have to keep your eye on the long term. Essentially what has been motivating this, I think, has been a Brotherhood attempt to just get a regular political process going. Because once you get regular politics going, they think they're going to do well. So that's why they're shoving hard on the Constitution. That's why they're willing to sometimes use heavy-handed techniques, sometimes make compromises, do whatever they can in order to do that. And that game is, I think, going in his favor despite all this back and forth, except that he's managed to alienate so much of the country. So it's going to be very difficult to have this political process go into normal operation at a time when you've got hundreds of thousands of people willing to demonstrate, and at this point, actual blood spilled and tempers really on edge.
Now, I, for one, am absolutely shocked that this brilliantly managed Egyptian transition produced a mediocre constitution at the end of it. I often quote you, Sir Professor Brown, for your remark made at our conference a year and a half ago when you described this as the stupidest political transition in history.
Yeah.
Do you still feel that way?
Yes, but to be fair, there's more to my statement. The stupidest transition in history, but I went on to quote Stephen Krasner, stupidity is not an interesting analytic construct. The reason you have such a transition process, in the sense that it's producing a stupid process, producing a stupid outcome, is because there was no real conscious moment of design. When you go back to February and March of 2011, you've got nobody in control. You've got the SCAF trying to figure out what to do, but you've got a transition process that was designed on the fly by an ad hoc committee which had no real experience, pushed through by a military that didn't know what it was doing, and a product really of very, very short-term political calculations and miscalculations by almost all parties. So you set up a very bad, or they set up a very bad process at the beginning, not because it was badly designed, but because it was simply not designed at all. It was produced by accident.
If you could go back and have Egypt do it again, was there anyone who had a blueprint that got it right? Should they have gone for the Constitution first? What should they have done differently if they wanted to avoid ending up where we are now?
The opposition to the referendum back in March of 2011 developed a plan, and it was actually a decent plan. The people who wanted to vote no for the constitutional amendments, it was you go to a presidency council. And what that does from the beginning, I mean, there are other elements of the plan, but what that does from the beginning is ensure that several people have a veto, several people have a seat at the table, and you can't really move forward unless most political actors are on board. Constitution first, parliamentary elections first, these all raise problems. How are you going to write a constitution without having people elected to write it? But what was missing, and I think the central mistake was made by the revolutionaries when they abdicated to the SCAF, and then woke up a month later and discovered the SCAF was in charge and that they weren't necessarily willing to share control of the transition process. That was where the mistake was made, and it's been very difficult to recover from that since.
All right. Thank you, Professor Brown, for joining us here. And I know you had to travel several thousand feet to join us here at George Washington University. Thank you for joining us at the POMEPS Conversations. And by the time this airs, we'll know who was right.